So how do authors create believable characters? And what do readers use as clues in order to interpret what those characters are really like? That's the topic of our video today. And we're specifically going to use the novel The Fifth Wave by Rick Yancey to answer those questions. However, these techniques, characterization techniques, can be used in any novel, and they will be helpful as things to annotate in To Kill a Mockingbird if you're in advanced. So let's actually look now at our lesson objectives as a sort of beginning point. Pause the video and read those objectives, and then we're going to go on to actually accomplishing them. All right, so there's two ways that authors create and describe characters. The first one doesn't get used very often. Direct characterization is where the author tells you mom's a jerk, or dad's angry, or something like that. That's telling you. Now, the other type, indirect characterization, that happens a lot more, and that's where the author shows you what a character's like. They create believable characters by giving you insight to what they look like, their appearance, their private thoughts, maybe, the thoughts of other characters about them, maybe, what the character does, and what the character says. And these are all things that you would annotate if you're in the class where you underline and label things in a book, or that you take note of if you're in a class that's looking at what's important and what's interesting. Okay, so pause the video and write down the types of characterization while I pull up our novel example, The Fifth Wave. All right, so what we're using as our example, the novel The Fifth Wave by Rick Yancey. This is in chapter 5. We're going to look at Cassie's father. He's a very minor character in the novel, but the author lets you know how he thinks and how he feels about things by some simple techniques. So I'm going to number the techniques I want you to look at and kind of label them. And I want you to read those paragraphs to yourself and decide what is it that the author's actually trying to do. All right? So here we go. Here's our first example I want you to look at. I want you to decide, is this direct or indirect characterization, and what you think it reveals about Cassie's dad. Lest I forget to give you some backstory if you haven't read this novel. There's a giant mothership has shown up in the sky, and Cassie and her father are sitting down to watch CNN, and it's sort of revealing what CNN thinks is happening. Okay? Let's actually look at our second example. All right, so I want you to read this paragraph, sort of as a response to Cassie saying, what if this mothership's coming to blow us up? And here's our last example. Again, read it, decide if it's direct or indirect characterization, and then tell me what you think it means. Okay, spoiler alert, this is from chapter 6, and they have just had a terrible disaster, and I'm not going to tell you exactly what the terrible disaster is, but I am going to show you another piece of Cassie's dad and what he says. Okay, so Cassie's dad is picking her up from school, and read example 4, decide if it's direct or indirect, and then tell me what you think it means. Okay, perhaps this is actually 5 rather than 4. Let's fix that. So here's another example of Cassie's dad. See if you can pause the video and figure out direct or indirect and what you think means. Okay, here's our last example. And things have gotten progressively worse. I'm not going to tell you how. But you take a look and read this exchange between Dad and Cassie.